to bring you Let's Go to Rihanna Mills at Kensington Palace.
That's right. Literally in the last minute or so, we now have the name for the Princess of Cambridge. She is to be called Charlotte Elizabeth Diana. In the full statement that we've received from Kensington Palace,
Princess Charlotte lowered her head, and the room went silent. For one brief second, the young princess did not look like a child caught inside another formal royal gathering. She looked as though she had made a decision. Her eyes dropped, her posture changed, and across the room, King Charles appeared to register the gesture with a reaction that was difficult to ignore. Those watching had expected ceremony. They had not expected that. The question was not why Charlotte knew how to show respect. Royal children grow up surrounded by protocol. The unsettling question was why she chose that exact moment to bow her head. According to the accounts surrounding this story, something had happened immediately beforehand. Something had been discussed away from the public eye, and the gesture that followed appeared to carry a meaning far heavier than a simple act of courtesy. Hi viewers, if you believe a young person should be heard when something important affects their future, leave a simple yes in the comments. Sometimes staying silent is exactly how important decisions continue without anyone questioning them. And if this story has made you look differently at Charlotte's bow, liking and sharing it helps more people decide for themselves what that moment really meant. Then Charlotte lifted her eyes again. Charles was still facing her. Nothing dramatic had been said aloud. No announcement had interrupted the gathering. No official declaration had been made. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. Those nearby could only watch as the king appeared to take in what had just happened. Charlotte had not rushed forward. She had not made a scene. She had simply lowered her head in honor, held the gesture for a moment, and returned to stillness. That was precisely what made it so striking. A loud confrontation would have been easy to understand. A public announcement would have explained itself. But silence leaves room for questions, and royal silence has always attracted attention. In this telling of the events, the gesture came after a tense exchange involving family expectations and royal protocol. The details of that exchange were not publicly established, leaving room for speculation about what Charlotte may have understood before she made that quiet gesture. And there was another detail that made the moment harder to dismiss. Charles appeared caught off guard. For a monarch accustomed to ceremonies, formal greetings, military occasions, state dinners, and countless carefully choreographed encounters, a respectful bow should hardly have been surprising. Yet the reaction described around this moment suggested something different. It was as though the gesture had arrived before he was ready for it. That raised a far more troubling question. What had Charlotte been told?
Stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, you know, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that.
The answer, if the reports and speculation surrounding the story were to be believed, was connected to a private family decision, not a public announcement. Not a ceremonial adjustment, something discussed behind closed doors, where only a small circle would have known what was being considered. Charlotte's response therefore became the mystery. Why would a young princess lower her head immediately after such a conversation? Was she acknowledging the king? Was she honoring something larger than the man standing in front of her? Or had she understood the weight of a decision that the adults around her believed was still safely contained within private walls? No one watching from a distance could know what was inside her mind. That distinction matters. A gesture can be witnessed. A private thought cannot. But the power of the moment came from the gap between those two things. The room saw the bow. The room did not see what led to it. That gap is where the entire mystery begins. Charlotte had already shown the composure expected of a member of the royal family. She had stood through formal occasions while cameras watched every movement. She had learned when to smile, when to wave, when to remain still, and when to follow the adults around her. But this moment appeared different, because there was no obvious reason for the gesture to carry such emotional force. And then came the reaction from Charles. He did not appear prepared for it. The king seemed to pause, as though the gesture had interrupted a thought already forming in his mind. For a moment, the usual rhythm of the gathering seemed to disappear. Conversations became background noise. Formality gave way to something much more personal. A grandfather looking at his granddaughter, a monarch looking at a member of the next generation, and perhaps, according to the speculation surrounding the scene, a man realizing that a child within his family was beginning to understand something about duty that adults had assumed she was still too young to grasp.
It's been obviously fantastic, and she's been a little joy of heaven. But at the same time, it's a more responsibility looking after two little ones, especially when George is around. He's a little monkey, but no, it's fantastic having a lovely little family, and I'm so thrilled. And Catherine has been doing an amazing job as well.
That possibility gives the bow an entirely different meaning. It was no longer simply about royal etiquette. It became a question of inheritance, expectation, and the strange burden placed upon children born into institutions older than almost anyone alive today. But there was still something missing. The conversation that supposedly came before the bow, that was the piece nobody in the room could fully explain. If Charlotte had simply followed an instruction, why did the moment feel so unexpected? If she had merely copied another member of the family, why did Charles appear surprised? And if the gesture was connected to the private discussion, why had the subject remained so carefully contained? Those questions began to surround the moment almost immediately. The speculation grew because the gesture itself offered no explanation. Charlotte did not speak. Charles did not explain. And nobody standing nearby could simply look at the bow and know what had passed between them moments before. That silence created its own tension. It suggested that whatever happened next would matter more than the bow itself. Because the real story was not the movement of Charlotte's head. It was what that movement may have revealed. There are moments in royal life when an entire debate can begin with something almost invisible. A glance, a pause, a hand placed on a shoulder, a change in expression, a child standing slightly differently from everyone else. This was one of those moments, and the reason it continues to attract attention is not because Charlotte performed some impossible act. It is because the gesture seemed to arrive at exactly the wrong time for anyone who believed it was meaningless. The king was reportedly shocked. Charlotte remained composed, and somewhere between those two reactions was a question that refused to disappear. Who had influenced her? The answer would lead directly back to the private conversation that had taken place before anyone outside that circle could understand what was happening. For Charles, the surprise may have been more personal than ceremonial. For Charlotte, the bow may have been an instinctive acknowledgement of something she had just learned, or perhaps observers simply saw an ordinary royal gesture and attached a deeper meaning to it. But there was one detail that made the mystery impossible to ignore. The gesture happened after the conversation, not before, and that was when people began wondering whether Charlotte's bow had been her answer. The conversation had ended, but Charlotte did not move. For several seconds, the room remained suspended in an uncomfortable quiet. The adults seemed to be waiting for the usual rhythm of royal ceremony to return. A glance here, a polite exchange there, someone moving toward the next part of the gathering. Instead, Charlotte lowered her head, and Charles watched. That was the detail that refused to disappear. According to the speculation surrounding the moment, the discussion immediately before the gesture had not been about ceremony at all. It had reportedly involved expectations placed upon the younger members of the family, and the question of how those expectations might change as the monarchy moved into another generation. Nothing had been announced publicly, nothing had been confirmed, yet the story suggested that Charlotte had somehow become aware of a decision that was supposed to remain within the family's private circle. That possibility changed everything. Because if Charlotte already knew, then her bow was not simply a reaction to the king. It may have been a response to what she had just heard. The distinction was enormous. A child can be taught to bow. A child can be reminded to stand properly. A child can be guided through a formal greeting. But a deliberate gesture made immediately after a serious family discussion carries another kind of weight when the person making it appears to understand why she is doing it. That was the question beginning to emerge around the gathering. How much had Charlotte actually understood? The answer could not be seen on her face. She remained remarkably composed. There was no visible panic, no sudden attempt to seek reassurance from her parents, no obvious sign that she wanted to escape the attention surrounding her. Instead, there was stillness. And sometimes, stillness says more than words. Charles, meanwhile, appeared to be processing the moment. The king had spent decades learning how to control his expression in front of cameras and crowds. His public life had trained him to absorb uncomfortable moments without immediately revealing what was happening beneath the surface. But the account surrounding this scene describes a brief reaction that seemed different. Surprise. Not outrage, not anger. Surprise. That distinction matters because it suggests that Charlotte's gesture may have caught him completely unprepared. If he had expected it, there would have been nothing unusual about it.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think need to happen.
If someone had instructed her to make the gesture, there would have been no mystery. But if Charlotte had acted on her own, after hearing something she had not previously known, the entire atmosphere becomes more difficult to explain. And that was where the private conversation became important. The discussion was reportedly held away from the public eye, with the subject centered on royal protocol and family expectations. The story does not establish precisely who said every word, and there is no verified record of a confidential exchange matching every detail described. But within the narrative surrounding the moment, one theme repeatedly surfaces: Charlotte's future. Not the throne, not immediate succession, her place within a changing institution. That distinction is crucial. George stands directly in line for the crown. His future has always carried a particular kind of expectation. Charlotte's position is different. She is close enough to the center of the family to attract enormous public attention, yet far enough from the throne to potentially occupy a very different role. That uncertainty can be both a freedom and a burden. It means Charlotte could eventually become one of the monarchy's most visible representatives without ever becoming its sovereign. And that is precisely why a conversation about her future could carry such significance. The monarchy has always used titles, ceremonies, responsibilities, and public appearances to communicate something beyond the individuals involved. A title can signal importance, a public role can signal trust, a ceremonial position can suggest continuity. But the people carrying those symbols are still human. And Charlotte is still young. That was the uncomfortable contrast hanging over the room. A child was standing at the center of an institution that measures time in generations. Her grandfather represented one generation. Her father represented the next. Her brother represented another future entirely. And Charlotte stood somewhere between those worlds. Then came the part that reportedly changed the atmosphere. A decision had allegedly been discussed concerning how Charlotte might be prepared for greater responsibility in the future. The precise details remain speculation, but the central idea was simple. She might not merely be expected to observe royal duty, she might eventually be expected to understand it. That sounds like a small difference. It is not. Observing ceremony is something a child can learn. Understanding the meaning behind it is something else. The distinction may have been what Charles suddenly recognized. Charlotte's gesture could have shown that she was beginning to understand the difference between being born royal and being responsible for what that position represents. That would explain why the reaction described around the moment felt so personal. It would also explain why the room seemed to change after she bowed, because suddenly the adults were not simply looking at a young princess. They were looking at someone who might one day carry a portion of the family's public responsibility. And that thought raises another uncomfortable question. Who had prepared her? If the private conversation was really the source of the gesture, then someone had either spoken to Charlotte directly or allowed her to hear something she was not previously expected to know. Either possibility creates tension, because royal families survive partly through control of information. Announcements are planned, statements are prepared, responsibilities are discussed privately before they become public. A child unexpectedly knowing something ahead of schedule could disrupt that carefully controlled sequence. That is why the alleged reaction from Charles becomes so important. Perhaps
I think more shock and dauntingness was more of the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, I think I was on such a high anyway, and so was Catherine, about George, that really we were happy to show him off to whoever wanted to see him. As any new parent knows, you're only too happy to show off your new child and, you know, proclaim that he's the best looking or the best everything.
the king was not shocked that Charlotte respected him. Perhaps he was shocked because she had understood something she was not supposed to reveal. And then she revealed it without saying a single word. That is the kind of moment that can haunt a room. A sentence can be corrected. A statement can be withdrawn. A speech can be rewritten. A gesture cannot be taken back once everyone has seen it. By lowering her head, Charlotte may have communicated something that words would have made far more dangerous. Or she may simply have performed an innocent act of respect that happened to occur after a private conversation. Both possibilities remain open, but uncertainty is exactly what gives the story its grip, because the more closely the moment is examined, the stranger the timing becomes. The conversation, the pause, Charlotte's expression, the bow, Charles's reaction, 5 seconds of movement can create hours of speculation. And there was another person whose position made the situation even more complicated: Prince William. As Charlotte's father and the future king, William represents the bridge between the monarch sitting before her and the generation that will eventually inherit the institution. Any serious discussion about Charlotte's future would inevitably exist within that larger succession story. William's role therefore adds another layer. Charlotte is not being prepared in isolation. Her future is connected to George's. It is connected to Louis's. It is connected to the choices made by William and Catherine. And ultimately, it is connected to the kind of monarchy Charles hopes to leave behind. That makes the alleged private conversation much more significant than an ordinary family discussion. It becomes a question of preparation. How much should a child know? How early should royal responsibility be introduced? And at what point does teaching a young princess about duty begin to take away the ordinary childhood she deserves? Those questions have no easy answers. But the story becomes even more compelling when the focus returns to Charlotte herself. She did not announce anything. She did not challenge anyone. She did not demand recognition. She simply lowered her head. And somehow, that was enough to make people wonder whether she had just acknowledged something far larger than the moment itself. If that gesture truly followed a private decision, then the next question is unavoidable. What exactly was that decision? Because the answer would determine whether Charlotte's bow was merely an act of respect, or the first visible sign that the royal family had begun preparing her for a role nobody had expected her to carry so soon. And that was the secret the room still appeared to be holding. The bow had been witnessed. The conversation had not, but if the two were connected, then Charlotte's silence may have said more than anyone realized. Before the gathering moved on, the king had one more thing to consider. The child standing before him might already have understood the weight of what had just been discussed. And if she had, then Charles was no longer looking at the moment as a grandfather surprised by a graceful gesture. He was looking at the future, because the most revealing part had not happened yet. The private decision was still hidden, and somewhere inside that decision was the reason Charlotte lowered her head. Charlotte did not look away. That was the moment the room seemed to change. The conversation had already moved into dangerous territory, at least according to the speculation surrounding what happened. A private decision had been discussed. Expectations had been raised. The future role of the younger generation had entered the conversation, and then Charlotte looked directly toward Charles. For a child surrounded by adults who had spent their lives mastering ceremony, it was an unusually deliberate moment. She lowered her head. Charles reacted. But the gesture did not end there. Charlotte remained still for another beat, as though she was waiting for something. Then she slowly raised her eyes again. Nothing was said. That silence became the loudest part of the entire encounter. Because if the speculation was correct, Charlotte already knew what the adults had been discussing. The question was how. The answer began with the decision itself. According to the story circulating around the moment, the family had been discussing a delicate question concerning Charlotte's future place within the monarchy. It was not presented as a decision about the throne. George remained the direct heir. Nobody was suggesting that Charlotte's position would suddenly replace his. The issue was something more subtle. How visible should Charlotte become? How much responsibility should eventually be placed upon her? And how early should she be prepared for it? Those questions might sound harmless from the outside. Inside a royal family, they can carry consequences for decades. A public role can follow a person for life. A title can become an expectation. A single ceremonial appearance can establish a pattern that future generations are expected to continue. The alleged discussion, therefore, centered on something larger than one young princess. It concerned the kind of institution Charles would eventually leave behind. The monarchy he inherited had already changed dramatically from the one known by previous generations. Public expectations were different. Information moved instantly. Private moments could become global stories within minutes. Royal children could no longer grow up completely shielded from public attention. Charlotte belonged to that new reality, and according to the accounts surrounding the gathering, somebody had begun considering whether she could become an important part of it. That was where the tension intensified. Because there was a difference between giving Charlotte a future role and asking her to understand that role while she was still a child. The adults in the room knew that. Charlotte may have sensed it too. The discussion reportedly moved toward responsibility, duty, and the expectations attached to being a senior member of the royal family. The exact words remain unknown, and there is no confirmed public record establishing the private exchange described in the story. But the rumor surrounding the moment suggests that Charlotte had somehow become aware of the direction of the conversation. Then something unexpected happened. She responded, not with words, with the bow. That was the first major reversal. What initially looked like a simple act of respect could now be interpreted as a response to information. And suddenly Charles's reaction made more sense. If he believed the conversation was private, he had little reason to expect a visible acknowledgement from Charlotte. Yet there she was, head lowered, expression composed, no hesitation. For Charles, that could have produced a very different kind of shock. He was not merely watching a granddaughter bow. He was potentially watching her acknowledge an idea that had only moments earlier belonged inside an adult conversation. The difference was enormous, because once a child understands the meaning behind a responsibility, the adults around that child begin to see time differently. The future suddenly feels closer. Charlotte's age becomes impossible to ignore. She is still young. She is still growing. She still belongs to a generation that should be learning about the world without carrying the full weight of it. Yet the royal institution has a peculiar way of making the future visible long before it arrives. A child born into the line of succession is never viewed only as a child. Every photograph becomes part of history. Every appearance becomes part of a public record. Every gesture can be interpreted. And Charlotte has spent her life inside that unusual pressure. Her position is especially fascinating because she occupies the space between two very different futures. George has an obvious constitutional path. Louis has a different place within the family. Charlotte has neither of those exact destinies. Her future is less predetermined. That gives her room to define herself. It also gives the monarchy an opportunity. A princess who can become a visible representative without being burdened by the immediate expectations of the crown could occupy a powerful position in a modern royal family. That possibility may have been at the heart of the private conversation. But then came the question of whether Charlotte herself had been ready to hear it. The story suggests she was, and her bow may have been the first sign. Charles's expression reportedly shifted because the gesture appeared to answer a question nobody had asked aloud. Did Charlotte understand? Her bow seemed to say yes. That was what made the moment uncomfortable. The adults could continue discussing strategy. They could talk about titles. They could discuss ceremonies. They could decide which responsibilities might eventually be appropriate. But once Charlotte demonstrated awareness, the conversation became personal. She was no longer merely the subject of the discussion. She had become part of it, and there was another layer to the moment. The bow was directed toward Charles. That choice mattered. A gesture of honor toward the monarch can represent respect for the individual, but it can also represent respect for the institution. For centuries, royal ceremonies have relied upon gestures because gestures communicate what speeches sometimes cannot. A bow says recognition. It says acknowledgement. It says that for one brief moment, the person making the gesture understands the position occupied by the person receiving it. Charlotte may simply have been following the customs she had been taught. That possibility cannot be ruled out. But the timing created the mystery. Why then? Why immediately after the private conversation? Why did Charles appear surprised? And why did the atmosphere become so tense afterward? Those questions continued to hang over the gathering. The more people considered the moment, the less ordinary it appeared. Then another possibility emerged. Perhaps Charlotte had not been formally told anything at all. Perhaps she had simply understood the mood of the room. Children often notice what adults believe they are hiding. They hear a change in tone. They notice when conversations stop. They recognize when somebody becomes unusually serious. They see expressions that adults quickly try to control. A child does not need every detail to understand that something important has happened. If that was what happened here, Charlotte's gesture may have been even more remarkable. She may not have known the entire decision. She may simply have recognized that Charles had been placed at the center of something important, and she chose to honor him. That interpretation is quieter. But in some ways it is more powerful, because it transforms the gesture from a calculated response into an instinctive one. Either way, the effect was the same. Charles was left facing a moment he had apparently not expected, and Charlotte had revealed something without revealing anything at all. That was the paradox. Her silence created more questions than a speech could have answered. Meanwhile, the alleged decision itself remained hidden. The public could speculate about Charlotte's future role. Royal watchers could debate possible titles. Commentators could wonder whether she might eventually become one of the more visible members of the family, but none of those possibilities explained why the gesture happened that day. The answer required going deeper, because the decision was reportedly not only about Charlotte's public responsibilities, it was also about the future image of the monarchy. Charles inherited an institution carrying centuries of tradition, but tradition alone could not guarantee relevance. The younger generation would eventually have to decide what parts of that tradition could survive unchanged, and what parts needed to evolve. Charlotte represented that question in human form. She was young enough to symbolize a new era, yet old enough, at least according to the story surrounding the gathering, to begin understanding the expectations attached to her name. That was the tension. The monarchy wanted continuity. The modern world demanded change. Charlotte stood between them, and Charles was standing directly in front of her. The king had spent his life preparing for the responsibilities of the crown. He understood better than almost anyone that royal duty was not simply about ceremonies. It could mean sacrifice. It could mean public scrutiny. It could mean having personal decisions examined by strangers. It could mean carrying expectations that began before birth and continued long after a person wanted to step away from them. Perhaps that was why Charlotte's gesture affected him. A bow from a young granddaughter can be sweet. A bow that appears to acknowledge the burden of royal duty can be something else entirely. It can be a reminder that the institution does not end with one generation. It continues through the children watching from the sidelines. And for Charles, that realization may have arrived unexpectedly. The king looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked back. For a moment, there was no need for explanation. The future was standing directly in front of him. But the story still had one final complication. If Charlotte had understood the conversation, someone had allowed her to understand it. And if someone had prepared her, the question became even more difficult. Who knew about the decision before Charles expected Charlotte to know? That was when the mystery moved beyond the bow itself, because perhaps Charles had not been shocked by Charlotte's respect. Perhaps he had been shocked by the possibility that she was already beginning to understand the role the family had been quietly considering for her. And if that was true, the bow was not the revelation. It was the warning. The young princess had just shown the room that she was listening. And once that became clear, the private decision could no longer remain quite as private as the adults had intended. The question now was not whether Charlotte could perform royal protocol. Everyone already knew she could. The question was whether she had begun to understand what that protocol meant. Because the answer to that question would determine how the entire moment should be remembered. A child honoring her grandfather was one thing. A future royal acknowledging a responsibility before it had even been publicly assigned was something else. And that was the possibility that left the room so unsettled. The bow lasted only seconds. The questions it created could last for years. Yet there was still one piece of the puzzle missing: the decision itself. What exactly had been discussed behind those closed doors? And why would that decision have made Charlotte lower her head in honor of King Charles at precisely that moment? The answer would take the story beyond protocol, beyond titles, and beyond a single royal gesture. Because the deeper issue was not what Charlotte had done, it was what the adults believed she was now ready to become. The room had gone quiet again. Charlotte stood where she had been standing moments earlier, composed, almost impossibly calm for someone so young. Charles looked toward her, and for a brief moment the formal atmosphere surrounding the gathering seemed to disappear. There was only a grandfather and his granddaughter. But according to the story surrounding this moment, Charles now understood something that had not been obvious when the conversation began. Charlotte had been listening. She had understood enough to respond, and that response had been a bow. The gesture itself was tiny, almost nothing, a slight lowering of the head, a pause, then the return to normal. Yet sometimes the smallest movements carry the heaviest meanings. That was why the moment refused to fade. The speculation surrounding the private exchange suggested that the family had been discussing what Charlotte's future could eventually look like. Not whether she would become queen, that path belonged to George. Not whether she would suddenly receive some extraordinary position. Nothing that dramatic had been established. The discussion was reportedly more subtle. It concerned responsibility, visibility, duty, and the possibility that Charlotte could one day become an important public figure within the monarchy. For Charles, those subjects were not abstract. He knew what royal duty demanded because he had spent his entire adult life living beneath it. He knew that public service could mean surrendering privacy. He knew that a title could open doors while simultaneously placing a person under a microscope. He also knew that Charlotte had not chosen any of this. She had been born into it. That realization may have been what made her gesture so difficult for him to dismiss. Because when a child bows, adults usually see innocence. But when a child begins to understand why she is bowing, the gesture becomes something else. It becomes a glimpse of the future. And perhaps that was the part Charles had not expected to see so clearly. Charlotte's future had always existed somewhere beyond the horizon. One day she would grow up. One day George would become king. One day William would inherit the crown. One day Charles himself would become a chapter in history rather than the person sitting at the center of it. Those facts were unavoidable. But seeing the next generation acknowledge them is different from knowing they exist. That difference can hit with extraordinary force. The story suggests that Charles had expected Charlotte to learn royal protocol gradually, through ceremonies, family occasions, and observation. What he may not have expected was such a direct indication that she was already absorbing the meaning behind the rituals. Her bow, therefore, became more than etiquette. It became a question. Was Charlotte beginning to understand what the Windsor name required from her? And if she was, how much had she already been told? No answer came. That silence was perhaps the most revealing part of all. Because the family did not immediately explain the gesture. There was no public statement clarifying its meaning. No announcement appeared to settle the speculation. The absence of an explanation left observers with only the moment itself. Charlotte lowered her head. Charles appeared surprised. And the private conversation remained private. That combination created a mystery powerful enough to survive long after the gathering ended. Yet there was another interpretation. Perhaps there had been no secret instruction at all. Perhaps Charlotte simply recognized the significance of the moment. Perhaps she saw her grandfather standing there and instinctively responded with respect. That possibility should not be ignored. Children can surprise adults without understanding the full weight of what they have done. A gesture can be innocent and still become meaningful when viewed through the lens of history. And Charlotte exists inside an extraordinary lens. Every appearance attracts attention. Every smile becomes a photograph. Every expression can be discussed. Every gesture can be replayed and interpreted. That is the unusual burden of being born into the royal family. For most children, a bow is a bow. For a young princess standing before a monarch, people immediately begin asking what it represents. That is where the story becomes bigger than Charlotte herself. Her position within the family makes her symbolic. George represents the direct line to the crown. Louis represents another branch of the future. Charlotte occupies a different space. She is close enough to the center to matter enormously, yet distant enough from the throne to potentially build a role around service rather than sovereignty. That could make her one of the most interesting figures of the next royal generation. Not because she is destined to rule, because she may have the freedom to define what royal duty looks like without carrying the immediate burden of becoming monarch. That possibility explains why discussions about her future can attract so much attention. Could she eventually become a working royal? Could she choose causes that reflect the concerns of her generation? Could she become a bridge between traditional royal ceremony and a public that increasingly demands authenticity? Nobody can know yet. Her future has not been written, but the speculation itself reveals something important. People are already looking at Charlotte and wondering what kind of royal she might become, and that is why her bow resonated so strongly. It seemed to compress an entire future into a few seconds. A young princess, a reigning king, a private discussion, a silent gesture, and a room suddenly aware that time was moving forward. Charles may have felt that more sharply than anyone else. For years he had stood as the future before eventually becoming the present. Now the future was standing in front of him in another form. Charlotte, a child carrying a family name filled with history. A granddaughter who could one day witness the reigns that follow his. A young person who may eventually have to decide how much of that inherited responsibility she is willing to carry. That is where the emotional weight of the story ultimately rests. Not in the possibility of a new title, not in palace gossip, not even in the mystery surrounding the conversation. It rests in the uncomfortable reality that royal children grow up beneath expectations they never requested. The public sees the ceremony, the family sees the child, and somewhere between those two perspectives, a person has to grow. That may explain why Charles appeared so affected. Perhaps he was not simply surprised. Perhaps he was reminded that Charlotte would one day have to make choices of her own. The monarchy could prepare her, the family could guide her, the institution could give her titles and responsibilities. But eventually the choice would belong to Charlotte, and that makes her bow feel strangely powerful. She did not announce that she accepted a future role. She did not promise anything. She did not speak. She simply acknowledged the moment, and sometimes that is enough. Hi viewers, if you believe Charlotte should be allowed to choose her own path before the royal institution decides what that path should look like, leave a simple yes in the comments. And if you believe moments like this deserve to be questioned instead of ignored, share this story with someone who follows the royal family. Your voice is part of what keeps these conversations alive, because there is a larger issue hiding underneath the fascination. How much of a child's future should be decided before that child is old enough to decide for herself? That question reaches far beyond the royal family. But inside the monarchy, it becomes impossible to ignore. Titles can be inherited. Duties can be assigned. Traditions can be passed from one generation to another. But identity cannot be handed down so easily. Charlotte will eventually have to decide who she is beyond the title. And perhaps that is what made the moment so moving. For a few seconds, the public could imagine seeing not simply Princess Charlotte, but a young woman beginning to understand the extraordinary life waiting for her. The bow may have been deliberate. It may have been instinctive. It may have been nothing more than a respectful gesture interpreted through the intense attention that follows every member of the royal family. The truth remains uncertain, but the reaction it produced tells its own story. People wanted to know what had happened before the bow. They wanted to know what Charles knew. They wanted to know what Charlotte knew, and most of all, they wanted to know whether that tiny gesture had revealed something the family was not yet ready to discuss publicly. That is why the unanswered question remains so compelling. If the bow was simply protocol, why did the moment feel so different? If it was personal, what had Charlotte been responding to? And if the private conversation truly concerned her future, why did Charles appear to be the one person caught off guard? Those questions are still more powerful than any easy answer, because an easy answer would end the story. Uncertainty keeps it alive, and the final image is perhaps the simplest one. Charlotte stands quietly. Charles watches her. The room begins to move again. Conversations resume. The ceremony continues. But something has changed. The young princess has shown that she is paying attention. The king has been reminded that the next generation is growing up, and the future of the monarchy, once something distant and theoretical, suddenly feels much closer. That is the hidden power of the moment. The bow lasted seconds. The meaning attached to it could last for decades. Perhaps one day, when Charlotte is older and her own public role is clearer, people will look back at moments like this and wonder whether the signs were already there. Perhaps they will remember the composure, the silence, the way she lowered her head, the way Charles reacted. Or perhaps history will remember it as nothing more than a graceful gesture from a young princess. Either way, the moment has already achieved something. It made people look twice. It made them question what they thought they had seen. And it reminded the world that within the royal family, the smallest movements can become enormous stories. For Charles, the shock may have lasted only a moment. For Charlotte, the meaning may not become clear until many years from now. But if the speculation surrounding that private conversation is even partly accurate, then her bow represented something far more profound than obedience. It represented recognition, recognition of the man before her, recognition of the institution behind him, and perhaps, most importantly, recognition of the responsibility waiting somewhere ahead. A responsibility Charlotte has not yet accepted publicly. A responsibility nobody can say with certainty she will ever want. A future that remains hers to shape. And that may be the most important truth hidden inside the entire story. The monarchy can give Charlotte a title. It can give her ceremony. It can give her history. But it cannot decide the person she ultimately becomes. That will belong to her. And perhaps that is why King Charles appeared so stunned when her head finally lowered. For one brief second, he may have seen the future not as a distant promise, but standing directly in front of him. A future with Charlotte in it, a future that had already begun, and a future that, despite all the planning inside royal walls, no one can completely control. If this moment made you stop and wonder what Charlotte's gesture really meant, subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Because royal history is not always written in speeches or official announcements. Sometimes it begins with silence. Sometimes it begins with a single look. And sometimes it begins with a young princess quietly lowering her head while a king realizes that the next generation has been watching all along.